You didn't imagine it. You weren't being dramatic. You weren't too sensitive or taking things the wrong way. What happened to you wasn't just the way church works or how God uses imperfect people. It was abuse. Systematic, calculated, deliberate abuse. They used God to control you, manipulated Scripture to dominate you, and weaponized your faith against your own well-being. They called it spiritual authority, divine order, biblical submission, but it was raw, unchecked power. And here's what makes it even more sinister. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't accidental leadership failure or well-meaning but misguided pastoral care. This was intentional psychological manipulation designed to create dependency, suppress autonomy, and maintain control. They created rules that served their interests, policies that protected their power, and systems that ensured their authority remained unquestioned. They built fear into every sermon, wove intimidation through every teaching, and embedded surveillance into every aspect of community life. They made you feel constantly watched, perpetually guilty, and systematically small. That's not discipleship. That's not spiritual formation. That's not biblical community. That's domination dressed in religious language. And the most devastating part? They taught you to think it was love. The system you experienced was carefully architected to break down your spiritual autonomy piece by piece, decision by decision, doubt by doubt. Every Sunday service became a reinforcement session for their worldview. Every Bible study was an opportunity to shape your thinking according to their interpretation. Every moment of ministry, every prophetic word, every counseling session, every leadership meeting was strategically designed to reinforce their control over your thoughts, your decisions, your relationships, and most critically, your understanding of who God is and how He relates to you. They didn't just want your attendance on Sundays. They wanted your complete intellectual, emotional, and spiritual surrender to their version of truth. They positioned themselves as the exclusive mediators between you and the divine, making their approval synonymous with God's approval, their disappointment equivalent to divine rejection. They made their authority unquestionable by calling it God's authority, their methods sacred by wrapping them in Scripture, their control necessary by convincing you that without it, you would certainly fall into deception, rebellion, or spiritual destruction. This wasn't just about church attendance or biblical interpretation. This was about colonizing your inner world, reshaping your spiritual DNA, and rebuilding your relationship with God according to their specifications. They systematically dismantled your ability to hear God for yourself, trust your own discernment, or maintain any spiritual independence that might threaten their position as your mediators to the divine. They made you believe that leaving them meant leaving God. So you stayed. You tolerated things that broke you slowly. You ignored the red flags. You swallowed the discomfort because they told you it was holy. They convinced you that questioning was rebellion, that boundaries were pride, that suffering under their system was proof of your faithfulness. And over time, you lost your voice, your joy, and your sense of who God really was. The manipulation was so subtle, so consistent, that you began to doubt your own perceptions. When something felt wrong, they taught you to distrust that feeling. When you felt uncomfortable with their demands, they convinced you it was your flesh resisting God's will. They weaponized Scripture against your conscience, using verses out of context to justify their overreach into every area of your life. Your finances, your relationships, your career choices, your personal decisions. Nothing was considered outside their sphere of influence. The devastating truth about religious control and manipulation. Let's be absolutely clear about something. God was never part of that system. He wasn't behind the fear-based preaching that kept you awake at night wondering if you were truly saved. He wasn't speaking through the guilt-laden messages that made you feel perpetually inadequate and spiritually deficient. He wasn't the author of your anxiety, your hypervigilance, your constant sense of being watched and evaluated. What you survived wasn't a season of spiritual refinement, divine discipline, or godly correction. It was psychological conditioning disguised as faith, emotional manipulation wrapped in biblical language, and systematic abuse perpetrated in the name of spiritual authority. And if you're still carrying the weight of it, if you still feel the heaviness of their words, the pressure of their expectations, the fear of their disapproval even though you've physically left their presence, it's because your soul hasn't had a safe place to breathe. Your nervous system is still operating from a state of chronic activation, still scanning for threats, still braced for the next spiritual assault. Your mind is still running their programs, still hearing their voices, still operating according to the rules they embedded in your psyche. That's why we're here now. To name what happened to you. To expose the mechanisms they use to control you. To validate the reality of your experience and the legitimacy of your pain. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, to create space for you to begin the slow, difficult, necessary work of healing from what was done to you in God's name. The conditioning they implemented went far deeper than you realized at the time, deeper than most people understand, deeper than even you may fully comprehend yet. They didn't just teach you what to believe about God, Scripture, faith, and spiritual life. They taught you how to think about these things. They created neural pathways in your brain that associated questioning with sin, curiosity with rebellion, independence with spiritual failure, and boundary setting with pride and selfishness. They trained you to monitor your own thoughts constantly, to police your own emotions relentlessly, to distrust your own God-given discernment systematically. They turned you into your own internal surveillance system, your own spiritual prison guard, your own harshest critic and judge. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't the unfortunate byproduct of well-meaning but misguided leadership. This was systematic psychological programming designed to make you completely dependent on their validation and utterly terrified of their disapproval. The most insidious part of their system was how they convinced you that their voice was God's voice, their will was His will, their approval was His approval, their interpretation of Scripture was the only accurate one, their way of doing things was the only biblically sound approach. They didn't just position themselves as leaders or teachers. They positioned themselves as prophets, apostles, and the very mouthpiece of God Himself. To disagree with them wasn't just disagreeing with human leadership, it was disagreeing with the Almighty. To question their methods wasn't just questioning their judgment, it was questioning divine wisdom itself. This created an impossible psychological bind. Your soul knew something was wrong, but your mind had been convinced that your soul was untrustworthy. Your spirit was crying out for freedom, but your theology told you that freedom was rebellion. Your heart was breaking under the weight of their demands, but your faith said that heartbreak was the price of holiness. You were trapped between what you felt and what you'd been taught to believe about those feelings, between what you experienced and what you'd been told those experiences meant. The lingering aftermath. When freedom feels like exile. You walked away from the religion, from the building, from the people, from the system that was slowly suffocating your soul. But it still lives inside you like a stubborn infection that refuses to heal completely. The external trappings are gone, but the internal architecture remains largely intact. You don't trust churches anymore, and why should you? Every sanctuary feels like a potential trap, every altar call sounds like emotional manipulation, every sermon raises your internal defenses. You don't trust people who quote the Bible too frequently or too confidently, because you've learned that Scripture can be weaponized, that verses can be twisted into tools of control, that God says can be the preface to someone's personal agenda. You sit in silence during what used to be your prayer time and wonder if God even wants anything to do with you anymore. Maybe you've disappointed Him by leaving. Maybe you've grieved His heart by walking away from His people. Maybe you've fallen into the very deception they warned you about, the pride they said would be your downfall, the rebellion they predicted would destroy your spiritual life. And when you do try to talk to Him, when you attempt to reconnect with a divine relationship that once felt so natural and life-giving, it feels fake, forced, artificial. Like you're repeating lines from a script you memorized long ago rather than having a genuine, spontaneous, authentic conversation with the Creator of your soul. But here's what you need to understand. That's not your fault. That disconnection, that artificiality, that sense of spiritual homelessness isn't evidence of your failure or your falling away or your spiritual decline. That's what happens when your connection to God has been filtered through fear, control, and manipulation for so long that you can barely remember what unmediated relationship with Him felt like. That's what happens when every prayer has been scrutinized, every spiritual experience has been evaluated and interpreted by others, every moment of worship has been performed under the watchful eyes of those who position themselves as the arbiters of authentic spirituality. The residual effects of spiritual abuse are more complex, more pervasive, and more long-lasting than most people understand. You might find yourself feeling anxious when you hear certain worship songs that were used to manipulate emotions in their services. You might be triggered by specific biblical phrases that were repeatedly used to justify their control over your life. You might feel uncomfortable around people who speak with religious authority, who claim to have direct revelation from God, who position themselves as spiritual fathers or mothers, who use language about covering and submission and divine order. Your nervous system learned to associate spiritual language with danger, religious environments with threat, and expressions of faith with potential manipulation. And now, even when you encounter genuine, healthy, life-giving expressions of Christianity, your internal alarm system goes off. Even when someone quotes scripture with pure motives, your defenses rise. Even when someone extends genuine pastoral care, you're scanning for hidden agendas. This hypervigilance is exhausting, but it's also completely understandable. Your soul is trying to protect you from experiencing that kind of harm again. You've been conditioned to expect manipulation whenever someone mentions God, control whenever someone speaks of spiritual authority, performance whenever someone talks about holiness. Your brain has created protective associations that served you well in a toxic environment, but now make it difficult to recognize and receive healthy spiritual relationship. This isn't spiritual weakness or lack of faith. This is trauma response, and it's actually evidence of your soul's wisdom, your spirit's determination to survive and protect itself from further harm. The complex emotional landscape of liberation. Some days you feel absolutely nothing, a kind of spiritual numbness that's both terrifying and oddly comforting. You're not angry, you're not sad, you're not even particularly confused. You're just empty, hollow. Like someone reached into your chest and scooped out the part of you that used to feel connected to the divine, the part that used to experience wonder and awe and spiritual hunger. The silence feels safer than the noise ever did, but it also feels like death. You wonder if this is what it means to be spiritually dead, if this is what happens when you walk away from God's people, if this numbness is the consequence they warned you about. Other days, you feel guilty for feeling free. The relief is so overwhelming, so complete, so life-giving that it scares you. You catch yourself laughing without permission, thinking without supervision, making decisions without consulting their opinions or seeking their approval. You realize you can read a book without wondering if it's on their approved list, watch a movie without calculating whether they would consider it appropriate, have a conversation without mentally editing it for spiritual correctness. And then the guilt hits like a wave. Maybe you've become too worldly, too carnal, too comfortable with things that should make you uncomfortable. You wonder if you're lost, drifting in spiritual space without the anchor of their community, their structure, their certainty. Or worse, you wonder if you've been deceived by peace, if the relief you feel is actually the enemy convincing you that you're better off without godly authority in your life. They taught you to distrust peace that came from walking away from their control, to interpret freedom as a dangerous delusion, to view your own happiness with suspicion. You don't miss the control, the constant surveillance, the endless rules and regulations that governed every aspect of your life. You don't miss the fear, the anxiety, the hypervigilance that kept you awake at night wondering if you were good enough, spiritual enough, surrendered enough. You don't miss the performance, the pretending, the exhausting effort to maintain an image of spiritual maturity that never felt authentic or sustainable. But you do miss the certainty, even though you now recognize that the certainty was false, built on their interpretations rather than your own relationship with God. You miss feeling right about everything, even though you now understand that righteousness had become performance, that being right had become more important than being real, that spiritual confidence had been replaced by spiritual arrogance. You miss the structure, even though that structure kept you trapped, even though it was more like a cage than a framework, even though it served their purposes more than your growth. There was something comforting about knowing exactly what was expected of you, exactly how to behave, exactly what to believe about every issue and situation. The ambiguity of freedom feels overwhelming after years of having every decision made for you, every opinion formed for you, every response predetermined for you. And the truth is, you don't know how to build a new life with God without recreating the cage you just escaped from. You don't know how to pursue spiritual growth without falling back into performance. You don't know how to seek God's will without surrendering your own discernment. You don't know how to be in community without losing your individual identity. You don't know how to submit to authority without becoming a doormat. You don't know how to be teachable without being gullible, how to be humble without being self-deprecating, how to be faithful without being fearful. The spiritual vocabulary you learned in their system is the only religious language you know, but every word feels contaminated now. Prayer feels like reciting scripts. Worship feels like performing for an audience. Bible study feels like searching for hidden meanings that will tell you what to do rather than encountering the living God who wants to be in relationship with you. You want to connect with God, but you don't know how to do it without using their methods, their language, their framework. And using those things feels like betraying your own freedom, like walking back into the very prison you fought so hard to escape. The hidden reality that no one discusses. That's the part no one talks about, the aspect of spiritual abuse recovery that gets overlooked in most conversations about leaving toxic church environments. Everyone focuses on the moment of walking away, the courage it takes to leave, the immediate relief of escaping the toxic system. But leaving a religious system doesn't instantly fix the damage that was done over months or years of systematic conditioning. The building may be in your rearview mirror, but the blueprint of that system is still running in your mind like malicious software that continues to operate even after you've deleted the original program. You can physically remove yourself from their presence and still carry the mental architecture of their control with you everywhere you go. You can stop attending their services and still hear their voices commenting on your choices. You can block their phone numbers and still feel their disapproval when you make decisions they wouldn't approve of. You can throw away their books and still find yourself thinking in their categories, evaluating yourself by their standards, measuring your spiritual life against their metrics. The psychological infrastructure they built in your mind doesn't automatically collapse when you walk out their doors. Those neural pathways they carved out through repetition and reinforcement don't immediately rewire themselves just because you've recognized the damage. The emotional programming they installed through fear, guilt, and shame doesn't uninstall itself simply because you've gained intellectual clarity about what happened to you. And unless someone helps you understand this, unless someone validates that the confusion you feel is a normal part of recovery rather than evidence of your spiritual failure, unless someone explains that the internal conflict is a predictable stage in the healing process rather than proof that you made the wrong decision in leaving, you'll start to think it's your fault again. You'll assume that if you were really free, really healed, really in God's will, you wouldn't still be struggling with their influence. But this is exactly what religious trauma looks like. This internal war between freedom and familiar bondage, between growth and comfortable stagnation, between authentic relationship with God and the counterfeit version they sold you. This is what healing from spiritual abuse feels like in the messy middle, before the breakthrough, in the valley between escape and recovery. And no, struggling with the aftermath of spiritual abuse doesn't make you less spiritual, less faithful, less devoted to God. It makes you honest about the real impact of what was done to you. It makes you truthful about the actual cost of the control they exercised over your life. It makes you authentic in a way that their system never allowed you to be, because their system required you to pretend that everything was fine, that their methods were working, that you were growing and thriving under their leadership even when your soul was withering. The confusion, the internal conflict, the spiritual vertigo you're experiencing, these aren't character flaws or faith deficits. These are the natural, predictable, completely understandable responses of someone who is trying to rebuild their relationship with God after having that relationship hijacked, manipulated, and controlled by people who used his name to serve their own purposes. You're not failing at recovery. You're succeeding at honesty. You're not falling short of healing. You're refusing to pretend that the damage wasn't real. Understanding the nature and scope of spiritual trauma. What you experienced has a name, and naming it is the first step toward healing from it. Spiritual trauma. This isn't just being hurt by church, or having a bad experience with organized religion, or going through a difficult season with leadership. This is the systematic psychological conditioning that happens when religious authority is deliberately used to control, manipulate, exploit, and abuse vulnerable people who are seeking authentic relationship with God. Spiritual trauma is the rewiring of your brain to associate God with fear instead of love, questioning with sin instead of growth, boundaries with rebellion instead of health, and independence with spiritual failure instead of maturity. It's the slow, methodical erosion of your ability to trust your own conscience, your own discernment, your own direct relationship with the divine. It's the replacement of authentic spiritual experience with performed spirituality, genuine faith with manufactured certainty, and personal relationship with God with institutional dependence on human mediators. Spiritual trauma is particularly insidious and devastating because it attacks the very core of your being. Your connection to the sacred, your sense of purpose and meaning, your understanding of love and acceptance, your relationship with the divine. When someone uses God to hurt you, manipulate you, control you, or exploit you, it doesn't just damage your faith in that person or that particular institution. It damages your faith in everything that should be most trustworthy, most safe, most life-giving in your spiritual experience. The symptoms of spiritual trauma are real, measurable, and profoundly disruptive to your emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being. Anxiety attacks when exposed to religious environments that should feel welcoming and safe. Panic responses triggered by spiritual language that should bring comfort and peace. Depression stemming from a sense of spiritual homelessness, of being cut off from the community and the God you once knew. Hypervigilance around religious authority figures who should be trustworthy shepherds of your soul. You might experience difficulty trusting your own perceptions and decisions after years of being told that your thoughts and feelings were unreliable, dangerous, or spiritually immature. You might struggle with shame cycles that seem impossible to break, waves of self-condemnation that feel both familiar and foreign, guilt that attaches itself to choices and behaviors that should be completely innocuous and normal. These aren't character flaws, personality defects, or spiritual weaknesses that you need to overcome through more prayer, more faith, or more commitment to spiritual disciplines. These are the natural, predictable responses of a nervous system that has been systematically conditioned to associate the sacred with danger, the divine with threat, and spiritual authority with potential harm. Your brain, in its wisdom, created these protective responses to keep you safe in an environment that was fundamentally unsafe. Your psyche developed these defense mechanisms because they were necessary for your survival in a system that was designed to break down your autonomy and independence. Your soul learned to be suspicious of spiritual language, religious environments, and authority figures because that suspicion was justified and protective in the context where you experienced spiritual abuse. The trauma isn't just about what happened to you in their system. It's about what didn't happen, what should have happened but was prevented or distorted by their control. You should have been able to develop your own relationship with God, but they inserted themselves as mediators. You should have been able to ask questions and explore doubts, but they punished curiosity and demanded unquestioning compliance. You should have been able to set boundaries and maintain your individual identity, but they required complete submission and absorption into their institutional identity. You should have been able to experience God's love as unconditional and freely given, but they made it contingent on your performance and compliance with their expectations. You should have been able to grow at your own pace and in your own way, but they demanded conformity to their timeline and their methods. You should have been able to find your own calling and purpose, but they defined your value in terms of your usefulness to their vision and their goals. The foundation of healing: brutal honesty and self-compassion. Healing doesn't begin in a church building, in a pastor's office, or in another religious institution that promises to do things differently this time. Healing doesn't begin with finding the right church, the healthy denomination, or the balanced spiritual community. Healing begins in the quiet, private space of your own heart and mind when you finally stop blaming yourself for what they did to you. It begins when you stop minimizing, rationalizing, or defending their behavior and start calling it what it actually was. It begins when you stop using their language to describe your experience, language that was designed to protect them and shame you. When you stop calling it church discipline and start calling it public humiliation. When you stop calling it spiritual correction and start calling it emotional abuse. When you stop calling it biblical submission and start calling it coercive control. When you stop calling it just how things were and start calling it systematic psychological manipulation designed to serve their purposes at the expense of your well-being. You can't heal from something you still defend, minimize, or rationalize. You can't recover from trauma that you're still protecting with euphemisms and spiritual language. You can't rebuild your relationship with God on top of a foundation of denial about what was done to you in His name. The first step toward healing is brutal honesty. Not with God, because He already knows exactly what happened to you and how it affected you. But with yourself. Because deep down, in the places where you've been afraid to look, you've felt the damage for years. You've known something was wrong, something was off, something was harmful about their system. You just didn't have permission to say it out loud. They convinced you that your discomfort was spiritual immaturity, that your questions were evidence of rebellion, that your need for boundaries was proof of pride. But your discomfort was actually wisdom. Your questions were actually intelligence. Your need for boundaries was actually health. Your soul was trying to protect you from harm, and they taught you to override those protective instincts and call them sin. The healing process requires you to do something that feels dangerous and unfamiliar after years of spiritual abuse. You have to learn to trust yourself again. You have to trust your perceptions about what happened to you, even when their voices in your head tell you that you're being too sensitive, too critical, too unforgiving. You have to trust your feelings about their treatment of you, even when their teachings tell you that feelings are unreliable and deceptive. You have to trust your instincts about what felt wrong in their system, even when they convinced you that those instincts were your flesh resisting God's work in your life. You have to trust your own memories of events, conversations, and experiences, even when they taught you to doubt your own perceptions and defer to their interpretations of reality. This is terrifying because they spent months or years systematically dismantling your confidence in your own judgment, your own discernment, your own ability to think clearly and perceive accurately. They taught you to second-guess every thought, question every feeling, and doubt every instinct that didn't align with their narrative about who you were, what you needed, and how you should respond to their leadership. But here's what they didn't want you to know, what they worked so hard to hide from you. Your conscience is not your enemy. Your questions are not rebellion. Your need for boundaries is not pride. Your desire for authentic relationship with God is not selfish. Your discomfort with their methods was not spiritual immaturity. These are healthy, normal, God-given aspects of who you are as a human being created in His image with a capacity for independent thought, genuine relationship, and spiritual discernment. They attack these parts of you not because they threaten God, but because they threaten their control over you. They couldn't maintain their authority over your life if you trusted your own ability to hear from God, make good decisions, and recognize unhealthy dynamics when you encountered them. They needed you to be dependent on their interpretation of everything in order to maintain their position as the mediators of your spiritual experience. Rejecting the performance model of spirituality. You won't heal by rushing back into another religious system, no matter how different it claims to be from the one that hurt you. You won't heal by trying to perform your way into God's presence again, attempting to prove your devotion through increased Bible reading, more disciplined prayer, greater involvement in ministry, or more generous giving. You've already walked that road. You've already exhausted yourself trying to be good enough, spiritual enough, surrendered enough, mature enough to earn approval, acceptance, and love from both human authorities and God Himself. The performance model of spirituality is exactly what broke you in the first place. It's what convinced you that your value was tied to your usefulness, that your worth was determined by your productivity, that your identity was inseparable from your function within their system. It's what taught you to evaluate yourself based on external metrics rather than internal transformation, to measure your spiritual life by how well you conformed to their expectations rather than how authentically you were growing in relationship with God. This time, if healing is going to be real and lasting, it has to be different. It has to be built on a completely different foundation, motivated by completely different desires, directed toward completely different goals. This time, healing looks like rest instead of striving, like silence instead of noise, like not needing to have all the answers instead of pretending you understand everything, like walking with God slowly and naturally instead of running frantically for approval that will always remain just out of reach. Real healing is not about proving anything to anyone. Not to them, not to other Christians who might question your choices, not to family members who might be concerned about your spiritual condition, not even to God Himself. It's about unlearning what hurt you, deconstructing the false beliefs that kept you trapped, and slowly, carefully, courageously relearning who God really is beyond their interpretation of Him, beyond their presentation of Him, beyond their use of Him to control and manipulate your life. This means you're going to have to develop a completely different relationship with spiritual disciplines, biblical study, prayer, worship, and community. You're going to have to learn how to engage with these things from a place of freedom rather than obligation, from curiosity rather than fear, from love rather than duty, from rest rather than performance. You're going to have to discover what it means to pursue God because you want to know Him, not because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't. You're going to have to unlearn the idea that God is keeping score, that He's maintaining a record of your spiritual activities, that He's more interested in your behavior than your heart, that He's more concerned with your compliance than your genuine transformation. You're going to have to discover that He actually wants relationship with you more than He wants service from you, that He desires your authentic self more than your performed spirituality, that He values your honest questions more than your pretended certainty. This process of unlearning and relearning is slow, nonlinear, often frustrating, and sometimes feels like you're moving backward rather than forward. There will be days when you miss the clarity of their rules, the certainty of their answers, the structure of their system. Not because those things were good for you, but because they were familiar, and familiarity can feel safer than freedom when freedom is new and untested. There will be moments when you wonder if you're just being lazy in your spiritual life, if you're using your trauma as an excuse to avoid the hard work of discipleship, if you're becoming too comfortable with grace and not serious enough about holiness. These doubts are normal and expected. They're part of how your mind processes the transition from performance-based spirituality to grace-based relationship. But they're not accurate assessments of your spiritual condition. They're echoes of their voice, residual programming from their system, familiar lies that feel true because you heard them so many times. The critical work of separation. Distinguishing God from the system. One of the most crucial and challenging aspects of healing from spiritual trauma is learning to separate God from what was done in His name. This might be the hardest part of your entire recovery journey, because their system was so effective at fusing their identity with God's identity, their voice with his voice, their character with his character, their love with his love, their approval with his approval, their methods with his methods. They convinced you that their interpretation of Scripture was the only accurate one, that their way of doing church was the only biblical way, that their understanding of spiritual authority was the only God-ordained structure, that their methods of discipline and correction were the only effective means of spiritual growth. They made it seem like questioning them was questioning God, like disagreeing with them was disagreeing with divine truth, like leaving them was leaving the kingdom of heaven itself. But they lied. They lied systematically, deliberately, consistently, and convincingly. They made it seem like their system was God's system, but it wasn't. They made it appear that their rules were sacred commandments, but they were man-made policies designed to serve their purposes. They presented their authority as divinely ordained, but it was human power seized and maintained through manipulation, fear, and control. And they wrapped all of this deception in biblical language, spiritual concepts, and religious terminology to make it nearly impossible for you to distinguish between what was truly from God and what was from them. God was never in the manipulation tactics they used against you. He wasn't behind the guilt trips that made you feel perpetually inadequate and spiritually deficient. He wasn't speaking through the fear-based messages that kept you awake at night wondering if you were truly saved, truly surrendered, truly committed enough to avoid spiritual disaster. He wasn't the author of the shame cycles that convinced you that you were too broken, too sinful, too selfish to deserve his love without their mediation. He wasn't behind the demands for blind obedience that required you to surrender your conscience, your discernment, and your ability to think critically about their teachings and methods. He wasn't in the prohibition against questions that should have been welcomed as signs of a curious, growing, engaged mind. He wasn't behind the punishment you received for setting boundaries that should have been celebrated as evidence of spiritual maturity and emotional health. He wasn't the source of the impossible standards that ensured you would always feel like a failure, always need their correction, always be dependent on their guidance and approval. He wasn't behind the constant monitoring of your behavior, thoughts, relationships, and spiritual activities that made you feel like you were living in a spiritual prison rather than experiencing the freedom that Christ died to give you. That was them. That was their voice, not his. That was their character, not his. That was their version of love, not his. That was their culture, their control, their system of domination disguised as discipleship, their program of conditioning disguised as spiritual formation. You have to stop confusing the pain they caused with the character of God, because while they were teaching you to perform for acceptance, he was loving you unconditionally, completely, without reservation or requirement. While they were threatening you with consequences for disobedience, disapproval, and independence, he was extending grace that covered every failure, every mistake, every moment of rebellion or confusion or doubt. While they were building walls between you and him through their complicated system of rules, regulations, and religious requirements, he was tearing down every barrier that separated you from his love, his presence, and his acceptance. While they were monitoring your external behavior and judging your spiritual condition based on your compliance with their expectations, he was looking at your heart with compassion, understanding the wounds they were inflicting, grieving the damage they were doing to your soul, and waiting patiently for the day when you would be free to know him as he really is rather than as they presented him to be. The difficult truth about healing. It takes time and patience. And here's the hard truth that no one wants to tell you, the reality that doesn't fit well in testimony services or healing conferences or inspirational social media posts. Healing from spiritual trauma is going to take time. Significant time. More time than you want it to take, more time than you think it should take, more time than well-meaning people around you think it should take. This isn't a quick fix, a weekend retreat solution, or a prayer and you're healed kind of situation. This is deep, complex, multifaceted work that involves your brain, your nervous system, your emotions, your relationships, your theology, your sense of identity, and your fundamental understanding of who God is and how he relates to you. Some days you'll feel completely numb, emotionally flat-lined, spiritually anesthetized. You'll sit in what used to be your prayer time and feel nothing. You'll read scripture and the words will seem like black marks on white paper with no life, no meaning, no connection to your heart or your circumstances. You'll hear worship music and feel like you're listening to a foreign language. You'll be around other Christians and feel like you're observing their spiritual experiences from behind glass, able to see but unable to participate, unable to connect, unable to feel what they're feeling or experience what they're experiencing. This numbness isn't spiritual death, though it might feel like it. It's not evidence that you've walked away from God or that He's walked away from you. It's not proof that you're backslidden, cold-hearted, or spiritually compromised. It's actually a protective mechanism, a way your psyche is giving you space to heal without the pressure of having to feel everything all at once. It's your soul's way of creating distance between you and the pain while you develop the emotional and spiritual resources you'll need to process what happened to you. Other days you'll feel angry, not just irritated or frustrated, but deep, volcanic rage that scares you with its intensity. You'll be angry at them for what they did to you, angry at yourself for staying as long as you did, angry at God for allowing it to happen, angry at the people who saw what was happening and said nothing, angry at the system that protects abusers and silences victims, angry at the culture that makes it so hard to name spiritual abuse and be believed when you do. This anger might feel unholy, unspiritual, unchristian. You might hear their voices in your head telling you that anger is sin, that forgiveness means you shouldn't feel angry, that your rage is evidence of your rebellious heart. But your anger is actually healthy, appropriate, and necessary. It's your soul's way of saying, that was wrong. I didn't deserve that. I'm worth more than how they treated me. Your anger is your internal justice system recognizing that a crime was committed against you, that boundaries were violated, that trust was broken, that harm was done. Some days you'll feel sad, not just disappointed or melancholy, but deep, grieving sadness for what was lost, what was stolen, what was never allowed to develop naturally. You'll grieve the years you spent in bondage to their system. You'll grieve the authentic relationship with God that was hijacked by their control. You'll grieve the community you thought you had, but that was actually conditional on your compliance. You'll grieve the version of yourself that might have developed if you had been allowed to grow freely, ask questions safely, and explore your relationship with God without their interference. And some days, you'll feel tempted to go back, not because you missed the abuse, but because the pain of freedom sometimes feels too quiet, too uncertain, too unstructured. You'll miss the clarity of their rules, even though those rules were oppressive. You'll miss the certainty of their answers, even though those answers were often wrong. You'll miss the community, even though it was toxic. You'll miss feeling like you belonged somewhere, even though you belonged only as long as you conformed to their expectations. This temptation to return is normal and doesn't mean you're weak or that you haven't really healed. It means you're human, and humans sometimes prefer familiar pain to unfamiliar freedom. It means you're grieving the loss of something that was never actually good for you, but that became part of your identity. It means you're in the difficult middle space between the old life that harmed you and the new life that you're still learning how to build. The recovery process doesn't follow a neat timeline or predictable stages. Some days you'll feel strong and clear about what happened to you. Other days you'll doubt yourself and wonder if you're just being too sensitive, too critical, too unforgiving. This back and forth is normal. It's part of how your brain processes trauma and rewrites the neural pathways that were carved out by years of conditioning. There will be setbacks. There will be triggers you didn't expect. There will be moments when their voice in your head feels louder than your own voice, when their interpretation of Scripture feels more authoritative than your own relationship with God. This doesn't mean you're failing or going backward. It means you're human, and healing from spiritual trauma is complex, nonlinear work. But there will also be breakthrough moments. Moments when you realize you can read the Bible without hearing their commentary. Moments when you can worship without performing. Moments when you can have a conversation with God that feels authentic, unfiltered, free from the scripts they wrote for you. These moments are glimpses of what's possible when you're no longer carrying the weight of their system inside your soul. Building a new foundation. The faith you're rebuilding won't look like what you had before, and that's exactly as it should be. It won't be built on fear, performance, or external validation. It won't require you to check your brain at the door or ignore your conscience when something feels wrong. It won't demand that you surrender your boundaries, your questions, or your need for authentic relationship. Instead, it will be built on grace, the radical, scandalous, system-destroying grace that says you are loved not because of what you do, but because of who you are. It will be rooted in freedom, the liberating truth that God created you to think, to question, to grow, to make choices, to be in relationship with Him as yourself, not as a performance of who you think He wants you to be. This new faith will be yours in a way the old one never was. It won't be borrowed from their interpretation, filtered through their system, or dependent on their approval. It will be the result of your own journey, your own questions, your own encounters with the God who was waiting for you all along, not behind their walls, but in the quiet, free spaces where authentic relationship becomes possible. The road ahead is not easy, but it is good. It's the path that leads from bondage to freedom, from performance to authenticity, from fear to love. And you don't have to walk it alone. There are others who have made this journey, who understand what you've been through, who can witness your pain and celebrate your progress. Most importantly, there is a God who never stopped loving you, never stopped believing in you, never stopped waiting for the day when you would be free to know him as he really is. Not as they said he was, but as he has always been. Gentle, patient, kind, and completely, utterly safe.